Did you know that the average person spends 6 months of their life waiting in line? But here's the real shocker. God often asks us to wait much longer for the things that truly matter. In this video, we're going to explore why waiting on God isn't just about patience. It's about transformation. Get ready to discover how your season of waiting could be the most important chapter of your life story. Have you ever felt like your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling? Like God has suddenly gone silent, leaving you in a spiritual void? It's a common experience that many believers face, especially during times of waiting. We're promised God's constant presence, yet sometimes it feels like He's nowhere to be found. This paradox can shake even the strongest faith to its core. Imagine Sarah, a devoted Christian who's been praying for a breakthrough in her career for months. At first, her prayers were filled with hope and excitement, but as weeks turned into months with no response, doubt began to creep in. Is God even listening? She wondered. Have I done something wrong? The silence was deafening, and Sarah felt more alone than ever. In our fast-paced world, this discomfort of waiting on God is amplified tenfold. We're used to instant gratification, same-day delivery, on-demand entertainment, instant messages. When God doesn't operate on our timeline, it can feel like torture. We start to question not just His timing, but His very existence and love for us. But what if we're looking at this all wrong? What if God's silence isn't a punishment or a sign of abandonment, but something far more profound? Consider the 400 years between the Old and New Testaments. During this time, God seemed to go radio silent. No prophets, no divine messages. Can you imagine how the Israelites felt? They must have wondered if God had forgotten them altogether. Yet, during this seeming silence, God was orchestrating the greatest event in human history, the coming of Jesus Christ. He was setting the stage, preparing the world for a revelation beyond anything they could have imagined. What appeared to be divine absence was actually intense divine activity behind the scenes. This brings us to a startling possibility. What if God's silence in your life right now is actually a sign of His deep work? What if, in the quiet, He's preparing you for something beyond your wildest dreams? It's a perspective that can transform our waiting from a burden to an adventure. Think about it. When a sculptor is creating a masterpiece, there are long periods where it looks like nothing is happening. The artist steps back, studies the work, plans the next move. To an outsider, it might seem like wasted time. But those moments of apparent inactivity are crucial to the final result. In the same way, God's silence might be His way of speaking volumes. We just need to learn how to listen. The psalmist understood this when he wrote, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and He shall yield. Strengthen thine heart, wait, I say, on the Lord." This isn't a command to passive inactivity, but an invitation to active trust. Waiting on God isn't about sitting around doing nothing. It's about leaning into the silence, listening with our hearts, and trusting that even when we can't see or hear Him, He's still working. It's about recognizing that our timeline isn't necessarily God's timeline and that His ways are higher than ours. C.S. Lewis, in his profound wisdom, warns us about the danger of misinterpreting God's silence. He cautions against coming to believe such dreadful things about Him during these times. It's all too easy to let our fears and doubts paint a false picture of God's character when He seems distant. Instead, we need to anchor ourselves in the truth of who God is, not in our fleeting emotions or circumstances. We need to remember that just as a parent's silence doesn't negate their love for their child, God's silence doesn't diminish His love for us. In fact, it might be evidence of His deep trust in our ability to grow through the waiting. So, the next time you feel like God has gone quiet, don't panic. Don't assume the worst. Instead, lean in, listen harder, trust deeper. Because in that silence, God might be preparing to speak in ways you've never heard before. He might be setting the stage for a revelation that will transform your life. Have you ever felt like your prayers are echoing in an empty room? Like God has stepped out for a cosmic coffee break, leaving you to wrestle with silence? Well, you're not alone. Even one of Christianity's greatest minds, C.S. Lewis, grappled with the ache of divine silence and the struggle to understand God's timing. C.S. Lewis, the intellectual giant behind works like Mere Christianity and The Chronicles of Narnia, wasn't just a brilliant writer and apologist. He was a man who knew the depths of doubt and the pain of waiting on God. His journey from atheism to Christianity, and then through the valleys of grief and uncertainty, offers us a powerful lens through which to view our own struggles with divine timing. In his book, A Grief Observed, Lewis laid bare his raw emotions after the death of his wife. He wrote, "When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him. But go to him when your need is desperate, what do you find? A door slammed in your face." Can you feel the anguish in those words? The frustration of unanswered prayers? It's a sentiment that many of us can relate to, especially when we're in the midst of our own waiting seasons. But Lewis didn't stop at expressing his pain. He dug deeper, challenging us to examine our own impatience and our modern tendency to demand instant results. He coined the term chronological snobbery to describe our habit of dismissing the wisdom of the past in favor of contemporary thought. This concept has profound implications for how we view God's timing. Think about it. How often do we grow frustrated with God because He's not moving at the speed of our smartphones or responding as quickly as our social media feeds? Lewis argues that this impatience, this chronological snobbery, can blind us to the deeper work God is doing in our lives. In Mere Christianity, Lewis offers a perspective that might just change how you view those seemingly endless periods of waiting. He suggests that our lives are like stories being written by God. Just as a good author carefully crafts each chapter, building tension and developing characters, God is writing our stories with divine precision. Every delay, every silence, every moment of waiting is a brushstroke in the masterpiece of our lives. But here's the kicker. We're not just passive characters in this story. Lewis challenges us to be active participants, to trust the author, even when we can't see the plot. He reminds us that God's sovereignty rules over all, including the chapters of our lives that feel unfinished or unclear. Now, you might be thinking, that's all well and good, but how do I actually do that? How do I trust when everything in me wants to doubt? Lewis doesn't shy away from this struggle. In fact, he offers some practical wisdom in the Screw Tape Letters. He warns us about the enemy's tactics to distract us during times of waiting, noting how focusing anxiously on the future can erode our faith. Instead, he encourages us to anchor ourselves in God's character and promises, even when, especially when, circumstances are uncertain. Lewis's insights invite us to see waiting not as a punishment or a sign of God's indifference, but as an opportunity for growth and transformation. What if those moments of silence are actually God's way of deepening our faith, of teaching us to trust not in our own understanding, but in His perfect timing? This perspective doesn't make waiting easy, but it does infuse it with purpose. It challenges us to look beyond our immediate desires and to trust in the greater story God is writing. It's an invitation to step out of our chronological snobbery and into a timeless trust in God's wisdom. Have you ever wondered why God seems to put His chosen ones through excruciatingly long periods of waiting? The stories of Joseph, David, and Sarah aren't just dusty history. They're blueprints for how God prepares us for greatness. These biblical heroes mastered the art of holy waiting, and their experiences hold the key to unlocking purpose in your own seasons of delay. Waiting is a recurring theme throughout the Bible, a stark contrast to our modern world of instant gratification. We often pray for immediate answers, quick fixes, and overnight success. But God's timeline operates on a different scale altogether. His plans unfold over years, sometimes decades, weaving a tapestry of divine purpose that we can't always see in the moment. Take Joseph, for instance. His story is a roller coaster of waiting, betrayal, and eventual triumph. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and thrown into prison, Joseph's life seemed to be one setback after another. Can you imagine the frustration he must have felt? The dreams God had given him seemed impossibly far away, as he languished in an Egyptian dungeon. But here's the thing, Joseph's waiting wasn't passive. Even in the depths of his imprisonment, he remained faithful to God. He used his gift of dream interpretation, he served others, and he never lost sight of the promise God had placed in his heart. And what was the result? God elevated Joseph to become second in command of all Egypt, placing him in a position to save countless lives during a devastating famine. Now, let's talk about David. Anointed as king when he was just a young shepherd boy, David had to wait approximately 15 years before he actually took the throne. 15 years! That's longer than some of us have been in our current jobs or relationships. During this time, David faced incredible challenges. He was hunted by the jealous King Saul, forced to live as a fugitive, and even had to pretend to be insane to escape danger. But David's waiting period wasn't just about surviving, it was about preparing. Through his trials, David learned leadership, strategy, and most importantly, how to depend wholly on God. The Psalms he wrote during this time reveal a man wrestling with doubt, fear, and frustration, yet always returning to trust in God's faithfulness. When David finally became king, he was not just older, but wiser and more spiritually mature. And then there's Sarah, whose story of waiting stretches the limits of human patience. Imagine being promised a child, only to wait decade after decade, with no sign of that promise being fulfilled. Sarah waited until she was 90 years old, well past childbearing age, before God's promise of a son was realized. Her story is a powerful reminder that God's timing often defies human logic and expectations. Sarah's wait wasn't easy. She struggled with doubt, even laughing in disbelief when angels predicted her pregnancy. But ultimately, her faith was rewarded with the birth of Isaac, whose name means laughter, a beautiful symbol of joy after long suffering. Sarah's experience shows us that God's promises may take time to fulfill, but they are always worth the wait. What do these stories teach us about waiting on God? First, they remind us that waiting isn't a punishment or a sign of God's indifference. Instead, it's often a time of preparation and growth. Joseph's time in prison honed his leadership skills. David's years as a fugitive deepened his reliance on God. Sarah's long wait magnified the miracle of Isaac's birth. Secondly, these stories highlight that faith isn't about passively sitting around. Joseph, David, and Sarah all remained active in their waiting. They continued to serve, to pray, to wrestle with their doubts, and to hold on to hope. Their waiting was dynamic, filled with growth and transformation. Lastly, these biblical heroes show us that God's timing, while often mysterious, is always perfect. Joseph's rise to power came just in time to save Egypt and his own family from famine. David's ascension to the throne happened when he was truly ready to lead, and Sarah's miracle child became the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham, setting the stage for the nation of Israel. Have you ever considered that the wait might be more valuable than the wish? While we're busy counting down the days, God might be counting up the ways He's molding us into something far greater than we ever imagined. Let's step into the unexpected sanctuary of God's waiting room and discover the hidden treasures within. In our fast-paced world, we're conditioned to expect instant results. We tap our phones and food appears at our doorstep. We click a button and our favorite show starts streaming. But God's economy operates on a different timeline. He's not interested in quick fixes or temporary solutions. He's in the business of deep, lasting transformation. Think about it. When you're waiting for something, doesn't your heart grow fonder for it? Doesn't your appreciation deepen? It's like God is allowing our spiritual taste buds to develop, preparing us to fully savor the blessings He has in store. But it's more than just anticipation. The wait itself is often where the real magic happens. Imagine you're in a gym, lifting weights. It's not the moment you pick up the weight that builds muscle. It's the resistance, the struggle, the holding on, when every fiber of your being wants to let go. That's where growth happens. Similarly, in God's waiting room, we're building spiritual muscle we didn't even know we needed. Research backs this up. Studies have shown that delayed gratification can lead to greater long-term satisfaction and success. It's like God is teaching us to savor the journey, not just rush to the destination. He's inviting us to find joy in the process, not just the outcome. But let's be real. Waiting isn't easy. It can feel like we're stuck in a spiritual desert, parched and longing for relief. Yet, it's often in these dry seasons that we learn to dig deep wells of faith. We're forced to rely on God in ways we never have before. As we lean into Him, we discover a peace that truly does surpass all understanding. Consider this. What if the very thing you're waiting for isn't as important as who you're becoming while you wait? God isn't just interested in changing your circumstances, He's interested in changing you. He's using this time to shape your character, refine your faith, and align your heart with His. Sometimes the unexpected blessings of waiting catch us completely off guard. One person shared how losing their job led them to a deeper reliance on God, which ultimately resulted in a more fulfilling career path that aligned with their passions. It's as if God was saying, I know you think you want this, but I have something even better in mind. C.S. Lewis captured this beautifully when he wrote, when we lose one blessing, another is often most unexpectedly given in its place. How many times have we looked back on periods of waiting and realized that God was working behind the scenes in ways we couldn't have imagined? But here's the real game changer. What if we could find joy in the waiting itself? Research suggests that maintaining a gratitude journal during waiting periods can enhance happiness and reduce anxiety. It's like we're training our spiritual eyes to see the blessings that are already all around us, even as we wait for something specific. This isn't about putting on a fake smile or pretending everything's fine when it's not. It's about choosing to trust that God is at work even when we can't see it. It's about believing that He's not just preparing a blessing for us, but He's preparing us for the blessing. Remember, waiting on God isn't passive. It's an active posture of faith. It's leaning into His presence, seeking His face, and allowing Him to do His transformative work in our hearts. As we wait, we're learning to sync our heartbeats with His, to align our desires with His will. So, what might we be missing by rushing God's timing? Perhaps we're short-circuiting our own growth. Maybe we're settling for good when God has great in store. What if the very delays we're frustrated by are actually divine detours leading us to unexpected blessings? You know that restless feeling when you're waiting for something big? It's like an itch you can't quite scratch, a longing that refuses to be silenced. But what if I told you that this energy could be harnessed for something extraordinary? What if your waiting room could become God's workshop and you're the masterpiece He's crafting? Let's talk about active waiting. It's not about twiddling our thumbs or pacing anxiously. No, it's about leaning into the pause, embracing the silence, and allowing God to work in us and through us. But here's a thought that might challenge you. What if there's such a thing as holy impatience? It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Yet it might be the key to unlocking a whole new dimension of your faith journey. Active waiting isn't about sitting still at all. In fact, it might be the most active thing you'll ever do. It's about engaging in spiritual disciplines that draw us closer to God, even when He seems distant. Think about it. Prayer, worship, and diving deep into Scripture. These aren't just activities to pass the time. They're tools that shape our hearts and minds, aligning them with God's will. Remember King David? He didn't just write beautiful psalms, he lived them. In Psalm 27:4, he expresses this burning desire. "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek Him in His temple." This isn't passive longing, it's active pursuit. It's about seeking God's presence with every fiber of our being, even in the midst of uncertainty. But let's be real, waiting isn't easy, especially when we're doing it alone. That's where community comes in. Surrounding yourself with fellow believers can be a game changer. They're not just cheerleaders, they're your spiritual workout buddies. They keep you accountable, encourage you when you're down, and remind you of God's faithfulness when your own memory fails you. Think about it this way. When you're waiting for a big race, you don't just sit on the couch eating chips, right? No, you train, you prepare, you get stronger. The same principle applies to our spiritual lives. Paul knew this when he wrote to the Galatians, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Galatians 6:9. He's reminding us that our efforts aren't in vain, even when we can't see immediate results. Now, here's a powerful tool that can transform your waiting season: gratitude. I know, it might sound cliché, but hear me out. When we're waiting, it's easy to focus on what we lack, on the unanswered prayers. But what if we flip the script? What if we started each day by listing the blessings we already have? It's not about ignoring our struggles, it's about shifting our focus. It's about recognizing God's faithfulness in the past as a promise for the future. And here's where it gets really exciting: serving others. When we're caught up in our own waiting, it's easy to become self-absorbed. But what if we use this time to be a blessing to others? It's not just about distraction, it's about aligning our hearts with God's. When we serve, we're participating in God's work, even as we wait for our own breakthrough. Let me tell you about C.S. Lewis. This guy wasn't just twiddling his thumbs while wrestling with his faith. No, he was engaging, questioning, exploring. His journey from atheism to Christianity wasn't a passive wait. It was an active pursuit of truth. And look at the result. His writings have touched millions, all because he chose to make his waiting productive. So, how do we turn our waiting room into a training ground? It starts with a shift in perspective. Instead of seeing waiting as a punishment or a delay, what if we saw it as preparation? What if every moment of waiting was actually God equipping us for what's to come? It's about being ready, not just reaching the destination. Have you ever felt like God's promises were mocking you rather than comforting you? In those long, dark nights of waiting, when hope seems to slip through your fingers like sand, it's easy to wonder if God's word is truly meant for you. But what if I told you that those very promises hold the key to not just surviving your wait, but thriving in it? Let's be real for a moment. Waiting is hard. It's not just inconvenient, it can be soul-crushing. When you've prayed until your knees ache and your tears have run dry, it's tempting to believe that God has forgotten you. But here's the thing, God's promises aren't just pretty words on a page. They're lifelines thrown to us in our deepest moments of despair. Think about it. Our perspective is so limited, isn't it? We see only what's right in front of us, like looking at life through a keyhole. But God? He sees the entire landscape of our lives, past, present, and future. His promises aren't just about making us feel better. They're glimpses into His eternal perspective. Take Isaiah 40:31, for example. It's a verse you've probably heard before, but let's really dig into it. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. This isn't just poetic language. It's a powerful promise of transformation. The Hebrew word for wait here is kava, which means more than just passively sitting around. It's about actively looking for, hoping, and expecting God to move. So, how do we practically claim and meditate on God's promises? It starts with immersing yourself in His Word. Don't just read it. Let it soak into your soul. Write down promises that speak to your situation. Speak them out loud. Let them be the first thought in your morning and the last whisper on your lips at night. But it's not just about individual effort. Different Christian traditions teach us about the power of community in claiming God's promises. Share your struggles with trusted friends. Let them remind you of God's faithfulness when your own faith falters. Pray together, declaring God's promises over each other's lives. Now, let's talk about a concept that might change how you view waiting, the already but not yet, in Christian theology. It's the idea that God's kingdom is here but not fully realized. His promises are true now, but their complete fulfillment is still coming. This tension is where we live, between the now and the not yet. It's in this space that our faith grows, where we learn to trust even when we can't see the full picture. I want you to meet Sarah. She waited 25 years for God to fulfill His promise of a son. 25 years, can you imagine? But in that wait, Sarah's faith was refined. When Isaac was finally born, his name, which means laughter, became a testament to the joy that follows faithful waiting. Or consider Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned. But even in the depths of a dungeon, Joseph clung to God's promises. Little did he know that every setback was preparing him for a position of incredible influence. His wait wasn't wasted. It was preparation. C.S. Lewis, that intellectual giant who journeyed from atheism to faith, understood the power of holding on to God's promises in dark times. He wrote, "Faith is the art of holding on to things in spite of your changing moods and circumstances." Lewis knew that our feelings can lie to us, but God's promises remain steadfast. So how can God's promises transform your waiting experience? They become anchors for your soul, keeping you steady when life's storms threaten to overwhelm you. They remind you that you're not forgotten, that your wait has purpose, that God is working even when you can't see it. Have you ever felt like you're stuck in a waiting room, expecting God to burst through the door with a grand announcement? We often yearn for those unmistakable signs from heaven, the burning bushes and parting seas that leave no doubt about God's presence. But what if God's most profound work happens in whispers, not shouts? What if the waiting room itself is where the real transformation takes place? C.S. Lewis, that brilliant explorer of faith, understood this deeply. He recognized that God's presence in our lives, especially during periods of waiting, isn't always obvious. It's like trying to spot a masterful artist at work. Sometimes all we see is a blank canvas, unaware of the intricate planning and preparation happening behind the scenes. Lewis noted that during times of grief and silence, it can feel as though God is absent. But here's the beautiful twist. This silence can be a profound experience of God's work in our lives, leading to deeper faith. So, how do we recognize God's handiwork in the seemingly stagnant seasons? It's all about developing spiritual discernment, a skill that's more art than science. Think of it as training your spiritual senses to pick up on God's frequency. One powerful way to do this is through the practice of gratitude. It's like tuning a radio. The more we focus on thankfulness, the clearer God's signal becomes. Keeping a gratitude journal or creating a blessing list isn't just a feel-good exercise. It's a way to actively participate in God's ongoing story in your life. As you jot down those moments of unexpected joy, those coincidences that feel a little too perfect, you're creating a record of God's faithfulness. And here's the kicker. Studies have shown that this practice of gratitude can significantly improve your mental well-being and resilience. It's not just good theology, it's good psychology too. But recognizing God's work goes beyond counting blessings. It's about reflecting on His past faithfulness and connecting the dots in your current circumstances. This is where journaling, prayer, and meditation on Scripture come into play. These spiritual disciplines aren't just boxes to check off. They're tools that help us cultivate a deeper awareness of God's presence. It's like developing a spiritual sixth sense, allowing you to perceive the subtle ways God is moving in your life. Remember, God's work often looks different than we expect. Sometimes it's not about dramatic changes in our external circumstances, but about the quiet transformation happening within us. Are you becoming more patient, more compassionate, more trusting? These are signs of God's sculpting hands, shaping you into the person He created you to be. It's also crucial to celebrate the small victories and growth along the way. Did you respond with grace in a situation that would have previously frustrated you? That's worth celebrating. Did you find peace in a moment of uncertainty? That's God at work. By acknowledging these small steps, we train our eyes to see God's movement in the wait. But here's the thing. Sometimes we only recognize God's work in hindsight. It's like assembling a puzzle without the box cover. As each piece falls into place, the bigger picture starts to emerge. That's why it's so important to share our experiences and testimonies with fellow believers. Your story of God's faithfulness might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to recognize His work in their own life. Isaiah 64:4 reminds us, "Since ancient times no one has heard, no ear has perceived, no eye has seen any God besides you, who acts on behalf of those who wait for Him." This verse is like a treasure map, pointing us to the hidden riches of God's work during our waiting seasons. It's an invitation to become spiritual treasure hunters, always on the lookout for signs of God's presence and activity. When we start recognizing God's work in the waiting, something incredible happens. The waiting itself is transformed. It's no longer a burden to be endured, but an adventure to be embraced. Each day becomes an opportunity to discover new evidence of God's love and faithfulness. The silence that once felt oppressive now feels pregnant with possibility. Have you ever felt like you're on the edge of something extraordinary, but you can't quite see it yet? That's often how God's timing works. It's like standing in front of a curtain, knowing there's a masterpiece behind it, but unable to peek. The silence of waiting can be deafening, but what if that silence is actually the calm before a storm of blessings? Consider for a moment, could your current period of waiting be setting the stage for a revelation so profound it will leave you breathless with awe at God's perfect timing? This isn't just wishful thinking. It's a pattern we see throughout Scripture and in the lives of countless believers today. Take the story of Lazarus, for instance. When Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus that their brother was sick, they probably expected Him to rush to their aid. But Jesus didn't. He waited. Can you imagine their confusion, their pain, as they watched their brother die? Yet Jesus had a greater plan in mind. When He finally arrived and raised Lazarus from the dead, it wasn't just a healing, it was a resurrection. A miracle so astounding that it left no doubt about His divine power. This story teaches us something crucial about God's timing. His delays are not denials, they're opportunities for greater miracles. When God makes you wait, He's not punishing you. He's preparing something beyond your wildest dreams. Or consider Esther, a Jewish girl who became Queen of Persia. For years, she might have wondered why God had placed her in the palace. Then came the moment when her people faced annihilation. Suddenly, her position made sense. As her cousin Mordecai said, she had come to the kingdom for such a time as this. God's timing aligned perfectly with Esther's courage to save an entire nation. These stories remind us that God's timing often looks different from our expectations. We want the burning bush, the parting sea, but sometimes God's greatest works happen in the quiet moments, in the seemingly ordinary days that are actually pregnant with purpose. Think about your own life. Have you ever had a door close only to find a better one opening later? Maybe you lost a job and it felt like the end of the world. But then, months later, you found yourself in a position you never could have imagined, one that perfectly matched your skills and passions. That's God's timing at work. Or perhaps you've prayed for healing, for a relationship, for a dream to come true. The silence has been long, and your heart aches with waiting. But what if, in this very moment, God is orchestrating circumstances, aligning people and events to bring about something far greater than you've asked for? Remember, God's sovereignty means He's in control of all events. As Isaiah 46:10 tells us, He declares the end from the beginning. He's not caught off guard by your circumstances. He's not scrambling to find a solution. He's already seen the end of your story, and He's carefully crafting each chapter. This truth should fill us with hope and anticipation. Yes, waiting is hard. It tests our faith, stretches our patience, but it's in these seasons of waiting that God often does His deepest work in us. He's shaping our character, refining our faith, preparing us for the blessings to come. And when God's timing is finally revealed, it often exceeds our greatest expectations. Just ask Abraham and Sarah. They waited 25 years for the son God promised them. 25 years of doubt, disappointment, and yes, some ill-advised attempts to speed up God's plan. But when Isaac was finally born, their joy was beyond measure. The long wait had magnified the miracle. Modern testimonies echo these biblical truths. People share stories of unexpected breakthroughs after years of seeming silence, of health issues that led to miraculous healings and deeper faith, of dreams fulfilled in ways they never could have orchestrated themselves. So, what might God be preparing in your life right now? What if the very thing you've been waiting for is about to burst onto the scene in a way that will make every moment of waiting worthwhile? As you stand in this moment on the cusp of God's reveal, let your heart flutter with anticipation, because when God's timing is unveiled, it often leaves us in awe of His wisdom, love, and perfect plan. As we reach the end of our journey, let's reflect on the transformative power of waiting on God. C.S. Lewis reminds us that faith is the art of holding on to things in spite of your changing moods and circumstances. This powerful truth challenges us to see waiting not as a passive state, but as an active expression of trust in God's perfect plan. Consider the words of Corrie ten Boom. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. How often do we find ourselves anxious about what lies ahead, forgetting that the one who holds our future knows us intimately? Your season of waiting, friend, could be the most transformative chapter of your life. It's in these moments of uncertainty that God often does His deepest work within us. Research shows that cultivating patience can lead to improved mental health and resilience. As you face your own periods of waiting, how will you choose to wait differently from this moment on? Will you lean into the silence, trusting that God is at work, even when you can't see it? The challenge before you is clear. Embrace the wait, for it may just be the soil in which your faith grows strongest.